you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective Podcast. My guest for this episode is my friend Den Jones. So Den, if you want to, give a little bit of background on yourself and where you're at now, and we'll kick things off.
Hey, Tony. Well, thanks for having me, and happy 2022, everybody. So Den Jones recently joined Banyan in December of 21 as their Chief Security Officer. And in that role, I've got the responsibility of running IT and running security, and then also our Banyan at Banyan program. And there's a great part of my role, which I'm really enjoying, which is getting to spend time with people in the industry, talking about all things security, including zero trust, whatever that means to the many people out there. I think that varies to begin with. And prior to Banyan, I was actually at Cisco and Adobe, where I ran enterprise security in both companies. And in both companies, had the identity stack, and in both companies also deployed zero trust. So I've got really great experience deploying zero trust to, over 100,000 people, which is kind of cool.
Okay. Now, before we go further, and I'm going to date myself here somewhat, but when I got into IT as a network admin and everything, one of the kind of prevailing vendors, architectures at the time was Banyan Vines, and I just want to clarify, your Banyan has no connection to Banyan Vines.
That's correct. Yeah. So we're Banyan Security. So it's banyansecurity.io is the website, and nothing to do with Banyan Vines. We don't even have a logo that has a tree or a vine or even a grape, so we're not even close to vines. But we always, people always bring it back to Banyan Vines, especially if you've been in the industry as long as we have, Tony, right?
Right. Well, I was going to say, like, I guess it will totally depend on what's the age demographic of the audience of this podcast, whether that is even relevant, because to people of a certain age, that's the first thing you think of if you hear Banyan in relation to information technology or whatever. And I think below a certain age, they'd be like, I don't know, I have no idea what you're talking about. Why are you even bringing that up? So, you talked about how what you did at Adobe, Cisco, and what you're doing now at Banyan, and you and I spoke previously on this podcast while you were at Adobe, about the kind of the zero trust deployments and things like that. And one of the things you just alluded to, though, is kind of where I'd like to start this conversation, which is what is zero trust, and I feel like I don't remember when you and I spoke. The podcast you and I did was 2 years ago?
Yeah, easily 2019 or 2020.
Okay, so 2-3 years ago.
Yeah.
And and obviously when John Kindervag first coined the term or whatever, that was 12 years ago, at least 10 years ago. So it's been around. And in other words, zero trust is not a new thing per se at all. However, I do feel like from what I'm seeing that it is a hot thing. Like it is a top of mind for 2022, like sort of partly in response to where things are in terms of companies being under siege with ransomware, and where things are in terms of the blurred lines between cybercrime and nation states attacks, and there are various factors in cybersecurity that are making zero trust be have greater value to organizations. And so I'm seeing a lot of people talk about that. The CISA, the government is focused on that. So even though it's not new, it is hot. And so but I would start with kind of, what is it? What is it to you? What do you think? If a company says they're doing zero trust, what should that mean?
Yeah, it's For me, it's first of all probably one of the most overused terms out there right now is, digital transformation, zero trust, XDR. There's just many of these buzzwords flying around. So I like to think of it as being, rather than the term, I really like to think about the outcomes. In our case, what we done at Adobe and Cisco, and really, so Banyan was one of the technologies we used in Adobe in our Zero Trust platform. So that's how I got the connection and got to know the team at Banyan. And in all of the deployments, what we were focused on was users accessing applications and services and enabling us to not worry about the network that the user was on. Ideally, you even take your Office network and make that like a guest network. And as you alluded to, if you follow any of the surveys out there, the term zero trust for most C-level people, apparently it's in their top 10 of priorities. I don't even know if they know why it's in their top 10. They probably heard the term so many times they figured they need to put it in there. And the boards maybe expect a zero trust thing these days. And then the other thing you alluded to is, security incidents. If you look at most of the security incidents that happen, I kind of believe that a good zero trust deployment, and I'd love to explain what I mean by that, but a good zero trust deployment has the ability to either prevent or slow down most of these attacks. So if you think of ransomware, if you can imagine ransomware comes in, and the way it comes in is someone clicked a link, and they click the link, their machine got infected. Now, in a traditional Office network, I can see your computer, you can see mine. It's a wide open Office network. And maybe from a segmentation perspective, I can't get into the data center network or an AWS network without going to be a Bastion host. That would be nice. Or a lab network might also be segmented. But it means in your Office network, I can still maybe see thousands of devices. Now, if my machine is compromised, I can then launch the attack as the bad actor to all the thousands of machines. Now, a good zero trust implementation for me is where you get to the position where your Office network is configured from security policies to only allow to get to the internet. And when you get to the internet, you get to a zero trust platform that allows you to access the applications and services that you've published. You can't get to the full network. You don't get all the ports and protocols. You only get to the app and service that you're publishing. And as part of that, we're also doing a posture check on the device. And then as part of that, we're enforcing a minimum security bar like 2FA, not using passwords any longer. So a lot of passwordless things in the industry. So if you can think about, these attacks, if you do this right, you can start to really, minimize or eliminate a lot of these attacks.
Okay. So let me give you sort of my personal take on zero trust, and then and let you respond, either agree or disagree. To me, it's and back from when I started in cybersecurity and got my CISSP and stuff, one of the primary focuses was on least privilege access. And when I was a network admin, all the things were, okay, well, don't let your users have admin rights on their local machines. And so a lot of cybersecurity revolved around saying, look, well, if Den Jones' credentials get compromised, the attacker is going to be able to execute malicious code with the permissions and access that Den Jones has. So let's just make sure he doesn't have that much, or try to contain it, which makes sense on some level. To me, zero trust is an evolution of that. It's basically saying, okay, yeah, that's true. It would be good for us to limit what you have access to. However, it's no longer good enough for me to just say, okay, well, Den Jones, he's the CSO, he's in this department, so we're going to give him access to these servers or these applications, and then just let you in the door and let you run free, because of the way network architecture has evolved and the way the attack ecosystem has evolved, that's no longer sufficient. Now I have to, check more often. I have to say, okay, I can't just, I guess the analogy would be, I can't just check your ID at the door. I have to check your ID as you go from the kitchen to the living room, when you go from the living room to the bedroom, when you go from the bedroom to the den. I have to keep checking your ID to make sure you're still you, and verify again, sort of, okay, well, why are you going to the living room? And do you have access to, permission to go in the living room, and all those kind of things. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really do see this as an evolution of the identity. We want to know it's you, but we also know that the way bad actors attack is they attack and then they masquerade as being you, right? So least privilege is very important. Continual authorization or authentication is really important. So we want to make sure that we'll continue those checks. But then also, it's not really about just being Den. It's Den from which device, right? Den has 3 devices, and I want to know that the posture of those devices are good. And if one device is compromised, I don't necessarily have to disable the Den account or change the password of the Den account. I might choose to change the password, but you could pull the certificate or revoke access from the one device that's compromised and enable Den to still be a productive employee with the other 2 devices. So it really, for me, is an evolution of, our identity and access management, defense and depth, right? I get to now say it's not just about being Den, it's about being Den and taking the context of Den, the context of the devices, and say that Den on this device is really one risk, and that Den on the other device is a different risk. And they're not necessarily the same risk because the devices are not the same. One of the things that was really cool, we deployed, built out a UABA capability and created a team called Security Intelligence back in Adobe in 2018, I think, or 2019. And that team was really just looking at all the authentication logs from various sources, but then also other logs like our travel system. So that if I suddenly see Den logging in from, Israel, the first thing is, well, is Den booked any travel to Israel, corporate travel, not personal travel, but at least we could get the corporate travel. And then you turn around and say, was that Den? And, then you can interact with Den. If you see Den coming in at a weird time from a weird device, and accessing weird applications, then you get to really think about, is that Den, right? When we moved over to Cisco, one of the teams, I built the same security intelligence function, and then within there, we partnered with Exabeam, and we delivered much the same stuff. I think using the information and all the logs we've got about who's accessing what applications and services and what their context is, I think is a really powerful thing. And it enables us to do way better security, but without being in the face of the users. So we start to now say, okay, well, I might want you to step up the authentication because I've seen you do something strange. I might want to prompt for a better security posture on the device because I've seen you come in from a strange country. Or maybe you're doing the same thing Den does every day and you're not behaving weird. You're not accessing weird applications that you never access and not doing weird stuff. So maybe I can actually reduce the prompts for authentication. Maybe I'm just letting you in more. Maybe you don't need to MFA all the time.
Right. Yeah. So I think part of what you just talked about. I definitely agree with So on the one hand, I think that zero trust is kind of an evolution of least privilege access, but it's identity and access management, but combined with the behavioral analytics. I think, and I think there are probably different takes on that. There are probably zero trust implementations that only have one or the other of those somehow, but maybe not without the identity. But I do think that's important because, for a few years now, cybersecurity used to be more, okay, well, And I'm going way back and preaching to the choir, but when you had, all right, this is our network, we're inside our building, here's our perimeter. I can basically trust everyone who's inside this perimeter, and everyone outside the perimeter is a bad guy, and we need to watch that. And when I was doing network admin stuff, we would look at server like access logs and review them to look for issues with people coming in or whatever, and we were looking specifically for like unknown accounts or unknown devices trying to connect. And the way the attack techniques have evolved in 10, 15 years, that's not really the case anymore. It's like it's much more likely to be a valid user from the perspective of you, the organization. It's very likely that the attack looks like an insider attack. Now, whether or not it's actually Den Jones, that's a different question. But what I'm really trying to look at is the behavior, because I can't just rely on the credentials part.
Yeah, that's exactly why we spun up the security intelligence teams in both companies, is because the way we're being attacked is the bad actor looks and feels like Dan Jones, from an identity perspective, an authentication perspective. One of the things you touched on was, that concept of you're in the corporate network. I remember an early slide that the team came up with years ago as we were, promoting the Zero Trust project in Adobe. And, it's that usual one with the castle and the moat around it. And they're like, that's how we used to think of this, but no longer, blah, blah. And really, it is a decent analogy. But the one thing is I kind of twisted all this round, and I just said, imagine a day where you're accessing applications and services and you don't need to use the VPN. Imagine that day. Imagine a day where you're doing that and you're not entering a password. And then it's like, imagine a day where you don't have to change your password every 90 days. I say, could you imagine that future? From a service desk perspective, we're going to save a ton of money. Imagine the day when lateral movement in your office network's a thing of the past. And then imagine the big compromises you see in the industry and feeling like, great, that'll never happen to us because we've done something about it. So when I always talk to people about this, it's almost a case of get people really passionate about the outcome, the terminology we use and all that stuff. That's not as cool as being able to tell someone, do you want to really lead a project or be part of a project where you're going to improve security, but you're also going to improve that user experience? Because user experience from a CIO perspective and the cost of running IT, that's hugely important. But if you go to the security executives and you're like, could you imagine not having to use usernames and passwords and we've got a certificate that's more secure, or we're not VPNing in. And the one thing about VPN that I think people always forget about is in large organizations, VPN configuration is usually that all full-time employees, they VPN in and they have wide open access to that corporate network. Maybe not the data center, maybe not labs, but they've got wide open access. So our proposition as part of the Zero Trust deployments we've done before, and one of Banyan's value propositions is we enable that access to applications without having to VPN in, and we're not exposing that one connection to be wide open once you're in your network. So you eliminate that one attack, that's huge.
Right. Well, I mean, the ransomware attack over I think it was Mother's Day weekend on Colonial Pipeline. The investigation eventually arrived at that they had this the zombie VPN account that people had forgotten about, that somehow that's how the attackers got in. And so you always run that risk that you have these accounts. When you create those accounts, someone's got to manage them, and companies typically do a pretty poor job of of removing accounts. Like they're really good at granting access. Like they get because people bug IT. So it's like kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of thing. As people are, hey, I need access, I need access, I need access. So IT says, okay, great, fine, whatever. Here, I'm giving you access to that. But when that person moves to another team or leaves the company, the processes that a lot of organizations have for trying to follow up on that are pretty bad. And I mean, I know for a fact that I still have an active email address from a company I haven't actively worked with in 8 years.
Now, so it's really, really interesting this. So one of the things that we done in Adobe with the security intelligence team, and it's really not user behavioral analysis. It's just simple, have you used this thing or not, right? So we started to look at stale accounts. And if it was a stale account, then we'd reach out to the manager of the account. Normally what you find in organizations, especially the large ones, full-time employee accounts, usually they've got great hygiene around that, about disabling that on exit because that's tied to an HR record. But the vendor accounts, generic accounts, service account type things, those are the ones that get created, they get the permissions, and then they get forgotten about. And if John leaves the company, then the 3 service accounts that John was managing, they are just left, and no one really knows what to do. Now, in our Adobe days, we done a great job of handling those accounts and, handing them off to the manager of John and telling the manager, you've now got a responsibility to do something, but you're still waiting on them doing something. And so what we started to do is say, well, wait a minute, let's flip this the other way. If we don't see these accounts logging into any applications or services over 90 days, we're just going to disable the account and notify John. And make it easy for John to re-enable or make it easy for him to add the access back. And then the other thing is all accounts, including your full-time employees, if we used Okta heavily in Adobe, it worked brilliantly for us. What we were doing is we were tying every published application to a group in AD and basically saying, if you haven't accessed that application via the Okta platform, then we know that you've not used it, you're not an active user, so we remove you from the group. So from a coarse grain access control, we're just removing you from the group. We'll notify you we've removed you, and then say, if you ever need access again, go here and request it, and it'll be automatically provided. But it means that you're not granting, they might request it, they might use it for a month, but then you're not granting that long-term access to things that people don't use. And going back to the Colonial Pipeline, it's not a zero trust play, but the reality is account hygiene is the basics of our industry. I mean, if you don't get the identity piece right, regardless of who you are or what you're doing, then you're just, you're increasing that risk significantly, So right. That was a great example of it.
Well, and sort of a peripheral conversation to zero trust itself is, we talk a lot in cybersecurity about, okay, well, you should have these best practices, you should have these tools, you should, patch known vulnerabilities, these are all the things you should do. And it's sort of shocking how many times you see an attack that succeeds and makes headlines that they did all those things and it was just some other stupid thing that wasn't on the list. Then it's just something someone missed.
Yeah, I think there's an acknowledgement in the industry that you can't get everything. There's always something hidden in some corner under some rock that you might forget about. But I kind of look at this as saying there's a reality of people, process, technology. Let's start with our people and have them educated to do the right thing and know what the right thing is. Patching, as an example, is one of those basic table stakes. When you get to things like account hygiene, when you get to things like configuring your app to use MFA, we need the application teams to understand that that's good and that should be done. So engage with your identity team. One of the things I wanted to circle back on was when you think about VPNs versus identity, right? So we give permissions at the identity level. We'll add you to a group to say you've got access to the app. But then when you do VPN, you also have these ACLs and VPN, lines of code usually that go in there that at a network level are now giving you access to something too. One of the great propositions on this thing done right is you no longer need to duplicate that work. Basically, if you're in the AD group or the directory group that gives you access to the app, then you don't need to duplicate the work at the network level, ACL and stuff. So that for me is really cool. And here's the thing about it. So now coming back to your point, right? There's things you forget because you don't have time to do it. We've all got limited resources and limited money, right? And because we've got that limited stuff, the value proposition that I would always take to the executives is, if we do these things here, you're going to reduce the amount of time we need to spend on managing your VPN. You're going to reduce the time at service desk, and that frees people's time up so that they can go do some of this other stuff. So ideally, we're simplifying the operation, which means there's less things for us to lose and forget about, as you just mentioned, right? So that one VPN account at Colonial, they didn't have time to find it maybe, or maybe if they had, saved money elsewhere, like, what I always talk to people about, saving money, they could reinvest that wisely and build a security intelligence team. Because if they did that, they would have found that account and realized that account was stale. I mean, it's not tricky.
Yeah. One of the other things that I think is a more recent development that is continuing exponentially that a lot of people don't really think about is when we think of zero trust and we think of identity and access management, we generally think of it in terms of, I'm giving Den Jones access, I'm giving Tony Bradley access, but the way things have evolved in terms of devices and network architecture, the device-to-device, machine-to-machine, those permissions are, 100-fold, 1,000-fold the users. And you start looking at, containerized applications and stuff, and like just the volume of permissions is far greater than the number of people.
Yeah. And this is where, device to device, so device to device is something that I think is an evolution of our problem, right? I mean, at the end of it, you're really still saying, I've got, in this case, maybe it's APIs, but somehow you're still talking about granting something permissions to talk to something else, right? And as you mentioned, this stuff spirals out of control, especially as you build large-scale cloud environments. We spent a lot of time, Adobe, Cisco, and Banyan has a huge focus on this as well, is, how do you protect those communications, from a visibility perspective at a CIO level. They don't see that problem as much because that's something that engineers just tackle and take care of. And you don't think of that as being something that spirals out of control and then is a bigger risk. Usually, if you do DevOps well, then you're securing that stuff early on in the cycle, and any scans are going to pick up things like vulnerabilities there or any like open doors, right? But at the end of it, it's a bit of a hidden problem because you don't have all your users, your workers in the company complaining about the experience of that. Whereas your employees complain about the experience of logging in. They complain about having to change their password. So it's a very vocal and visible experience problem. Whereas the device to device stuff, it's engineers just kind of take care of it. And it doesn't ever bubble up as being something that needs attention. But it certainly does, because if you don't secure that stuff very well and one engineer device gets compromised, then within your ecosystem, that device to device communication will enable a bad actor to move around pretty quick.
Yeah. On a semi-related note, in the beginning you talked about trying to be passwordless, and I know there's been a push with that. Microsoft introduced the ability to go passwordless, at least for Microsoft stuff. So maybe it's a step in the right direction, but on my Windows machine, I have a bunch of other stuff too that's not Microsoft, so that's only a partial solution. You got other vendors like Banyan Security, trying to work on that stuff that it is a broader, it applies more broadly, but still only applies to the companies that sign on for that. But I was going to go into a little bit of like the password management and strong passwords and 2FA, MFA, all that. In that, I've noticed that on both the Windows side, when I'm in the Edge browser, or if I'm on my iPhone, that features have been introduced where they try to automatically just go, hey, you know what, you need to create a password. Let me create this secure password for you, and it creates 20 characters of gibberish. Yeah. Which on the one hand might be okay. Like you'd say, okay, well, that's probably better than me naming it after my dog or my birth date or whatever. However, I never accept those, because then it's only on that device. Now when I go to log into that same application or service on my, if I accept the 20 character gibberish password on my iPhone, now when I go to log in on my Windows PC into that same application, I have to try to remember, well, what the hell was that password? And then you have things like LastPass, which I or other password vault type things, which I've used, but then I keep seeing LastPass seems to come up in the headlines, once or twice a year for possibly having the master passwords breached. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a big problem.
Yeah, LastPass is not a password manager I use any longer. It was one of the original options that we shared with people in Adobe. I'm a huge password manager fan, and here's why. Because like you say, if you're using your browser, it will be on that browser, on that device, depending on the browser. Chrome, for example, might say, oh, let me share this with your other devices that also have Chrome. But I don't always use just one browser. Sometimes I'm Chrome, sometimes I'm Safari. So I might jump about between browsers, depending on the application or service. And then the other thing is I've got a work device, and then I've got a personal device. I've got several personal devices. So I don't use my work device for doing any personal type work. So I use that just for work. And I don't use my personal devices for any work stuff. So I like to have that separation. The one thing I do want to do, though, is have a password manager where it is continually creating passwords that I don't know, where I do need a master password, where I do need 2FA to get into it. And that enables the passwords to basically be consumed and available on any of my devices, on any of the browsers at any time. And it also enables me not to worry about passwords. If in your corporate environment, the company does a really good job and they tie all the applications you use to your identity stack, so they're using your IDP, and as part of that authentication with your IDP, you're doing a passwordless type scenario, which is what we promote. Then your corporate username and passwords, there's really not much there. You'll have some things, especially if you're an admin, and you might have some break glass accounts or things of that nature. But ultimately, there's not many passwords in your corporate environment any longer. But my personal environment, my personal password manager has hundreds of passwords, because I've got so many things. I mean, it could be your Netflix account, your bank account, your whatever.
Well, there's so many things that make you create sign in, and it's just like I where I've created profiles on websites that I have no intention of like ever going back to, or I might use it once every 3 years, but part of using the website in the first place, it required me to create a username and password, and I'm like, all right, those things that's a whole separate conversation of, I think businesses need to reconsider how they do that, because I'm like, why are you forcing people to create these like what are destined to be zombie accounts?
Yeah, and and absolutely it comes back to the business thinking. They want to understand who they can market to. They want to understand more about you and your habits and things of that nature. But the principle in security, right, is don't capture any data that you don't have to. The least amount of data, just the basics you need in order to deliver that service or capability, and don't go one attribute beyond that, because you shouldn't be, as a business, storing any information that you don't truly need for delivering that service.
Right. Well, so related to all that, on when it comes to like the two-factor, multi-factor, there's a ton of things that will say, hey, I'm gonna send you a code to your phone. So I mean, I'm just in the regular course of an average day, I probably have that happen 5 times. With different apps and services where it's like, all right, we're gonna send you a text code. But I've also got on my phone 3 different applications called Authenticator. Like if I just search, so there's the Microsoft Authenticator, there's the Google Authenticator, and there's ID Me, which is like a government, federal government authenticator. And then I also have Okta. So that part, I think, it on the one hand, it's a somewhat trivial. Like it's a silly thing for people to complain about. It's a silly thing for me to complain about. It's really not that big a deal. But that is something that I think that's where the users are going to push back. Users are going to be like, okay, well, you're asking me to do this 2-factor authentication or whatever. You're telling me I need to do that for better security. But now all of a sudden I've got 20 different services that are texting me codes. I've got 5 different authenticator things on my phone that I have to verify against. And it's like, can we just consolidate all that to one?
Yeah, you love that, right? I think the reality is that I just checked. I've only got 3, Tony. So you're beating me if we're going up by who's got the most. But yeah, I'd love that. I think that the reality is your corporate life. They're pushing the Oktas of the world, and then the other one that's heavily is the Symantec VIP access. So that's one that I've seen a lot of people use. But then for me, like I jumped on Google Authenticator for my personal stuff because it's such an easy MFA app to use. I always think of companies from a business perspective. And they must be using MFA. Like that's not a question in my mind any longer. In your personal life, I don't think everything needs to have MFA, but I certainly think if anything that's tied to your money or your personal, really sensitive information, like your social security number or any of those things, government sites that you might use for your taxes, any of these things, if at all possible, those you should use MFA for. So I'm a big fan. But I mean, I've been in the identity game for so long now. So for me, that's just table stakes. But if I go speak to my parents about it, they're now beginning to realize MFA is a good thing, but they don't know why. They only know because I'm telling them. But there's a bunch of people out there that aren't really tech savvy, that aren't necessarily going to be all over the MFA business. And, right. That's the world we live in, right?
Yeah. Well, and I know that there are potential issues with the SMS texting code version, because that can be hijacked, redirected and such. But I generally, especially if I'm actually doing something on my phone, prefer that one, because at least in iOS, and I assume Android does the same thing, I don't know, it will auto-populate it. Like you're in the app, and as soon as the thing comes in, it just it says, hey, do you want to use this code? And it's like, all right, cool. I don't even have to look at the code. I don't have to know what it is. So that's kind of nice. But like I said, it's definitely a first world problem to complain about,
Yes.
oh my God, I tried to get into my Netflix account and it made me enter a code from my phone.
Yeah, I know, right? I tell my kids that all the time. It's like we have first world problems. The things that we complain about in our life, there's many people way worse off than us. And I would be glad if people in the corporate world complained about using MFA, because at least then I know they're using MFA. But I think the reality is it's really our responsibility as service providers in that case to say, okay, I do want you to use MFA, but I always said to people, it's not single sign-on. It's never been single sign-on. And it's not always two-factor. I always think of it like dynamic authentication, because really what I want to get to position to is we have enough data in the back end to be able to really accurately determine whether your account is in good standing or not, or whether your account may be compromised. And with all that data we've got, we could get smarter about the user experience and say, I'm not prompting for second factor as many times in a day, because maybe you just done it once. And I know enough about the device, the context of the device, the user, and the context of the user combined with that device. I now know we know it's Tony. We know Tony's got a device which has got all the security goodness on it, and we know he's coming in from the exact same space, doing the exact same stuff. Why do I need to prompt the guy to log in again? So I really want the industry to kind of keep moving in this direction, because there are a lot of great vendors out there that are pushing a passwordless, more dynamic, security context aware kind of experience.
Well, it would be nice. I mean, I'm a huge fan of logging in with facial recognition, both with Face ID on my iPhone, with Windows Hello on my PC. I've got that's basically the only way I log in. So I agree that all those things are good, and I think people just need to get used to it. And it's sort of like when they started making people wear seatbelts. Again, I'm dating myself. Because there's a whole generation of people who were like, what do you mean you didn't have to wear seatbelts? But there were people who were like, felt very put out and like, oh my God, why are you making me do this? And it's like, it eventually just becomes second nature, and you can't imagine not doing it. And I think that's kind of where we have to get with that stuff. But it's interesting to see sort of the balance between, on the one hand, having the authenticators and the two-factor authentication and all of that, and then on the other hand, kind of going in the completely other direction of having the facial recognition and just saying, look, yes, you recognize me, I'm me, just log me in. But I think what you mentioned in the beginning and just kind of hit on again, with the way you're implementing zero trust, it is dynamic, because it's like, okay, well, yes, if I don't know you, I'm absolutely going to double check this and make sure that you're someone that I should trust, and I'm going to keep on checking. But if I do know you and you're coming in from the same device you always do, from the same source IP address that you always do, you're accessing the same applications that you always do, then yeah, I really don't need to keep bothering you.
Yeah. And so one of the things I was thinking about this, I used to say to people, oh, if you were logging into your bank account, you want to have 2FA because you like to keep the money in the bank and you don't want bad people to steal it, right? But I think that's evolved over the years because that's quite a rare risk. But kids today, especially younger people, they would be totally put out if their social media account was taken over by someone, and then some really bad stuff was said on their behalf or whatever, right? Or they looked stupid or were made a fool of on social media. So it's funny, and I do think now in corporate life, I think a really good zero trust implementation, or really just really good security hygiene. We're in a position now where we do know more about the devices. I think of biometrics and stuff like that. 10 years ago, before Apple and the consumer market started to use things like your thumbprint to unlock your phone, then in the corporate world, the use of biometrics was something that people really shied away from. They didn't really want to do it. But the minute it became a consumer-friendly experience that people really enjoyed, then in your workplace, people started to expect it. I remember my first ever biometrics deployment was around 1995, and I worked in a factory in Scotland. And what we were doing was we had Compaq and Novell, and Compaq would ship a little biometrics reader that you could configure in NDS, right? And people would actually be able to use that to log in. And that goes all the way back to the late 90s. And it really took like 20 years for that technology, to improve and mature and at a price point that was usable, but then really consumers to actually want to use it and be able to use it in a way that was not something that you'd have to train them to do, right? You don't have to train someone now to use their biometrics on their device or their fingerprint to log into their laptop.
Right. So, all right. Well, I think it's a fun conversation. I appreciate having you back on. I look forward to chatting further. And hopefully, we talked a little bit before we started about how RSA got pushed back to June, but I plan on being there. I assume you'll be there. So, fingers crossed that COVID chills out and we all get to go to San Francisco in June.
Yeah, I'd love that, Tony. It'd be great to catch up in person. And hopefully for everybody out there, if they're at RSA, then certainly feel free to look us up at banyansecurity.io. And, we're going to be hosting a whole bunch of events. So I'm looking forward to meeting people in person. So hopefully COVID doesn't get in the way of that. It's already got it pushed out, but hopefully we get this thing going forward.
Awesome. All right. Take care.
Thanks, Tony. All the best, everyone.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions that you'd like to see answered in future posts.